Hello and welcome to The Driven Wheel. Underneath the overcast skies of 70s Britain, Jaguar were having a quiet revolution. Their gorgeous E-Type was due for replacement, and designer Malcolm Sayer had a vision of a low-slung, truly aerodynamic coupe. The styling was as divisive upon launch as it is today. Prominent buttresses and long overhangs made it a unique sight, but what a departure for Jaguar. The most conservative of companies dared to be different, surprising the press and the public with a car that would remain in production for 20 years. Launched amid the first fuel crisis, its success was never assured, but this unique car deserved to succeed. Initially only fitted with the V12 and available with both auto and manual transmissions, these were fast cars back in the mid-70s. The aforementioned fuel crisis and challenging styling meant sales were slower than they might have been. Those that did take the plunge tended to be delighted with the power and handling, less so with the rust-proofing and complete intolerance of being overheated. In 1983, Jaguar fitted their 3.6 straight-six engine, which was considerably more fuel efficient than the V12 and only about 50 horsepower down in power. This, coupled with the lower weight, made them very nearly as quick as the V12s. Handling was improved by having less weight up front, and with a manual box, these were considered to be the most driver-oriented of the XJS range. We're fortunate enough today to be driving one of these cars. It's a 1990 and it's got a manual gearbox. Let's have a look at it, what it's like to live with and what it's like to drive. The interior's aged well, its doeskin and tweed, yes really, is definitely back on trend, and I love the roller barrel readouts for battery and oil pressure. The steering wheel is fabulous and it's thin rimmed. It's a behemoth running through a traditional hydraulic power steering setup. Criticised upon release for being too light, compared to a modern setup it tends towards the heavy, and it does an excellent job of transmitting the road surface up to your fingertips. This wheel has no airbag, but it does have a crash pad fitted, which makes it much uglier than its two-spoke predecessor, which is a shame. Now Jaguar fitted a Hvac system called a Delaunay Mark III, which is an interesting creation. It's a curious mix of very loud but ineffective fans and complex analogue mechanisms which are prone to braking. This one here works about as well as they ever do, but it's a far cry from modern systems. It is, however, pretty good at demisting the car on cold mornings, which does make it better than many of its contemporaries. The seats are comfortable, and most drivers, even tall ones, will be able to find a relaxed seating position. The rear seats are best left to children, and Jaguar thoughtfully provided them with large ashtrays so they can smoke in there. Adults can squeeze in for short journeys, but kids and luggage are honestly their main purpose. The radio in this one is stock, and it's complete with the automatic rising aerial for bonus retro points. Fitted with a 230 horsepower AJ6 engine fueled by a Bosch multi-point setup, these have a deserved reputation for being bomb-proof and over-engineered. It's not in a high state of tune, and most of its issues stem from old age rather than poor build quality. The oil coolers and lines tend to go pop if they're original, and the airflow meter will be past its best by now. If the hoses are as old as the car, then particularly one above the exhaust manifold will be knackered and liable to burst at an inopportune moment. Attend to these small items and it'll just work. They sound great but understated. Have a listen. The manual Getrag 5-speed gearbox here has a long throw and it can balk slightly when cold, but it's strong and it's dependable. It's not up there with the best manual boxes, but it's a decent and enjoyable effort. Problems here are most unlikely, and it's infinitely superior to the dated autos. Now let's talk about this car's biggest Achilles heel. It's the bodywork. Well, it's more a question of where doesn't it rust than where does it. Drains block, the arches fill with mud and fall apart, scuttles fill with leaves and rot out, the windscreens leak and A-pillars disintegrate, the sills rust, the bonnets rust, and so do the front and rear valances. The complexity here, the multiple steel skins, and almost total lack of factory rust-proofing mean that if you want one of these, then buy something solid. If it's a pair, it's going to cost more than the value of the car to put right, and although prices have risen, they haven't risen that much. Now this car has just had all of its suspension bushings, dampers, brakes, steering rack and tyres changed. It's completely solid and mechanically excellent, bar the weird springy mounting for the back of the gearbox, which probably wants renewing. I've driven others in far less than perfect order, and they have all felt refined and relaxed on the road. This one though with new suspension really does showcase Jaguar's car design and handling. They might not have been very good at rust proofing, but they knew a bit about cornering and ride. And there's a lot of rubber in the suspension and steering. The rack itself, depending on the bushings, is flexibly mounted, resulting in a springy feeling to the setup. This is well documented and easily rectified with the right mounts. Lots of these cars, perhaps most of them, have tired bushings and dampers. They still drive remarkably well like this, but when all are renewed it transforms them into good riding, wieldy road cars. Polybushes, as usual, are best used sparingly, but on the anti-roll bars here they do improve the turn-in enough to make them recommended. Driven really hard it starts to come apart, especially the rear suspension, which struggles over bumps when the car's fully loaded up. With stock dampers at the rear they feel a bit underdamped, and it's one of the first areas I'd spend money on here if I wanted better road holding. This particular car has ABS. Unfortunately, being from the 1990s, it's got quite an early version, which means it's pretty poor. Pedal feel is springy and it's imprecise and probably contributed to by the servo. Don't get me wrong, the brakes have power and they'll stand repeated fast stops on the road, but honestly, it's at the age where it gets confused by gravel or expansion joints. Given the choice, I'd bin it. Later setups improve hugely, but this one is poor. Around town, the front visibility is great, contrasted by the rear quarters, which is terrible. So bad in fact that Germans refused it type approval, and no, this wasn't just sour grapes after the war, they did the same thing to the Lancia Monte Carlo. Visibility is distinctly compromised, and it makes you learn to use your mirrors. The enormous bonnet means T-junctions have to be approached with caution, but these are all things you get used to. Now as a town car it has to be conceded, especially in small European villages, that it's hard work. Get it on the open road, however, it all starts to make a lot more sense. On a B road you'd expect a car this heavy and this large to fall apart, but it doesn't. Sure, driven really quickly it'll bottom out, top out and get a bit wobbly, but at 7 or 8 tenths is where it feels its best. Don't stretch it too much, but just use it to cover ground. Here it excels. Small wheels and large sidewall tyres make it flow elastically down roads, imbuing confidence with turn-in and steering feel which defies its weight. It's a difficult trick to pull off with straight line stability and good turn-in, but the XJS manages it. Now there's a lot of body roll, which is a compromise, but it's worth it for the ride quality. The seats are quite soft, and because you sink down into them, they hold you remarkably well during quick driving. All of these came fitted with a proper locking differential. In the wet you can tease it into small slides, and if you want to it'll hold quite big angles. Now, this is obviously not how most people drive them, but it's really good to know how predictable they are over the limit, especially as none came fitted with any form of stability control. A roads and motorways make this car imperious. It's refined all the way up to silly speeds, which is an absolute credit to the designers and engineers who worked on it. It's staggering to think that a car which started its gestation in 1970 can be driven one-handed at 100 miles an hour while handling like this does. Now, obviously a car like this is never going to be truly sporty, so why compromise it with big wheels or stiff suspension? Just enjoy it for what it is, a fast A-road or motorway ground coverer. Sorted ones are reliable and they can happily be used every day. They have a sense of occasion about them and they just look wonderful parked up. Now, I'm a fan of the looks. I admire Jaguar's bravery in making the things in the first place. Its unique silhouette and great dynamics are a credit to when the British motor industry just got it right. If you fancy one, then buy the best you can afford, and I guarantee you're going to enjoy it. Thank you for listening to The Driven Wheel. I'll see you again soon.